Have you ever looked back at an old lesson and realized that it wasn't as great as you thought it was? I've had that experience a lot of times throughout my career. I'm Erin Sadler, and this is Sadler Science. And I'm going to talk to you about updating a lesson that I created a few years ago and show you how it used to be really traditional and what I would do instead today if I were going to do this lesson again in order to increase student engagement. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you like this new activity, I am posting it in my Teachers Pay Teachers store, and I will link to that below. I started this activity the same way that I'm going to start the updated activity. I just asked students why we ask questions. Then I went straight into the lecture part where I told students the 9 types of science questions that they can ask, which questions can be investigated, which types of questions can't be investigated, and gave them basically a lecture on investigative questions. It's not terrible, but it's also not particularly engaging, and students are just expected to write. They're not interacting with the material at all. Next, I had my students work in small groups, and I gave them 3 separate scenarios and asked them to write an investigative question for each scenario. This isn't horrible. It's not the worst, least engaging thing that I've ever done, but this is not an explore before explain activity. So, what I mean by that is I'm explaining everything up front. The kids aren't having to do any exploration or any sense making in order to be able to do this. I'm doing all of that work for them in the beginning. And there's 2 problems with that. The first is that it's not engaging. The second is that it usually leads to less understanding on their part, and it means that I'm going to have to walk around the classroom a lot more and answer a lot more questions in order to have students write these scenarios. So, among the things that are going to be different about this is that the format is going to be a little bit different, just because I've gotten better at making my stuff look nicer. That really doesn't have anything to do with the content. So, that is an update, but that's just kind of an added bonus. So, our objective with this update is to teach students to ask investigative questions. That's still the same, but with this new version, I want to increase student engagement, understanding, and movement. I want to make sure that they're understanding the content, but still getting them up and moving and making sure that they're engaged in what's happening without doing things like giving them candy or anything like that. I also want to decrease the teacher talk time. I've talked a lot about that whole phrase, whoever is doing the talking is the one who's doing the learning. So we want to decrease teacher talk time as much as possible. And this will also reduce the number of student behavior issues. It's much easier for students to behave if they're not being expected to sit quietly throughout an entire lesson. Also, I just have to say that for myself, this is so much less taxing on me personally to run a class like this than it is to sit and or stand up in front of the entire class and have them listen to me speak. So I would start this lesson with a think, pair, share this time. And I would just start with a very basic question that anybody could answer. I would give students really like 30 seconds to think. Then they would talk to their neighbor and they would share. One of the things that I've noticed with this in classrooms is that a lot of teachers don't give that think time, and we need our students who are quiet processors to have that time. Also, I think a lot of people disregard the think, pair, share and think it's too basic, but it is a really nice way to get your students talking and engaging in the content. The other thing that I want to point out is that even though this seems really basic, students have a negative connotation when it comes to asking questions in a classroom environment. A lot of times they think that this means that they are not paying attention if they have to ask a question, or they think that they are showing that they don't understand something. So then that means that they feel inadequate or something like that. So we want to normalize asking questions within your science classroom. So this is just a nice little way to get that going. Next, we're going to do a card sort, and I've created an activity with 24 cards that students can sort, and they just have different types of questions on it. I would have students do a card sort in groups of 2 to 3. Once you get into 4, it kind of gets to be a little bit too much and people like break off into partners. But depending on the dynamic in your class, that can be okay too. But we don't want groups of like 5 or 6. That would be too much. So I don't give students a lot of direction when it comes to card sorts. If they ask what they're supposed to be doing, I tell them that I want them to sort them based on similarities and differences. And I always instruct them to read through all of the cards so that they can start to recognize patterns before they start sorting. There are several reasons that I like card sort activities. The first is that they're super, super easy to create. The other reason that I like this format is because it's a low floor, high ceiling activity. And what I mean by that is that all students can access the material here. All of your middle school students will be able to read through the questions and put them into groups. The other thing that I really like about this is that because it's such an easy entry point, it's the students who you see who typically do really well might not be the ones who are doing super well with this type of activity because anybody can access it. You'll see some of your students who don't typically perform well doing a lot better with this type of activity. So then I'm going to come back to whole group and I'm going to ask students what categories they made with their cards. Another problem that I typically see teachers do is they'll go through and they'll go from group to group to group and have each group share. And while that's fine, the problem is that while group 1 is going, group 6 is sitting there bored and not paying attention. So we want this to move a little bit more quickly. One of the ways that you can do that is by asking just one group to present and then having the other groups do a quick whip around and just say what else they added, what other categories they had. The other thing that we do is if students agree with a category that was created by the first team that's presenting, I have them snap, like do snaps for the group. And so then everybody's engaging and affirming that group and providing feedback on the type of categories without it having to take a super long time in your class. So I'm going to skip this piece. This is something I would do whole group. I wouldn't do it in a like new or creative way. But then the next thing that I would do is I would pick a particular card. I try to always have one in any card sort activity where there's some sort of controversial something that will get kids interested and engaged and kind of willing to debate a little bit. So this is the one that typically gets the kids that I work with most excited because they want to talk about aliens and so what I do is I put this up and I say, is this a scientific question? And then I want them to tell me why or why not. What but instead of like going around and sharing and having only like 4 or 5 students participate, I have them take 30 seconds and quietly think about their response. And then everybody's going to get up and move. So we do a this or that activity with this type of question. And if they believe that it's a scientific question, they're going to move to the left of the room. And if they believe that it's not, they're going to move to the right of the room. So everybody is expected to participate. And then when they're within that group, they're going to talk about why they came up with that answer. This gives everybody the opportunity to speak within that group, and it makes it so that they don't have to present in front of the entire class. What typically happens with this is that they'll break off into smaller groups within the yes group and the no group, and people will be able to talk. What we really want students to do is to be talking and thinking. Also, we get a lot of questions from teachers about like, what is the like classroom management looking like here? And I have to say that because students are moving around and engaging a lot more, the classroom management is generally not as much of an issue. But of course, you're going to have well established expectations in order for something like this to work in your classroom. I've seen even the most difficult classes do really well with this type of activity, though. So don't make the assumption that your students can't do this. So then I spend just like 2 or 3 minutes talking about investigative questions. I give them information about what investigative questions are not. So I give them some non examples, which is always a great way to integrate to help with student understanding. And then I'm going to have them do writing. So I would guess that the first part of this activity, if we're keeping everything moving really quickly, this will take about 30 minutes. Students aren't getting into the writing piece, which is, of course, the more difficult skill, until they already feel confident. So I'm going to have them take their thoughts about what investigative questions are and are not and write them down. And again, we've been through this before, and so they're a little bit familiar with this already. Some of the things that you can do if you have a less confident class is you can allow them to answer this in groups. You can also post your presentation online so that they can access it and go back and look at the slides where it talks about investigative questions and non-investigative questions, or whatever your topic is that you're discussing. And then from there, I would have them apply what they've learned to a new situation. So in this case, I would have students look at a few different scenarios and then write their own investigative questions. So that could be the end of the class period. We could be done from there. But I always like having more movement and more engagement and really checking for understanding with students. So what I would do is I would put posters around the classroom, and I would give them space to write their questions. And I would make I would make one poster for each scenario or two posters for each scenario and have students travel from scenario to scenario in their groups. Maybe give them 2 minutes at each scenario to write down their question and then scoot around the classroom. And then they can star questions that they think are really good. Um, they could write questions down next to questions that they're not quite sure if it's an investigative question, and they can interact with what students have already done in a way that's not, we're going over the material without me having to lead that piece. So, I hope that this has given you some ideas for how you can update your lessons to make them more engaging and increase student movement and interaction and get them really talking in class without a lot of work on your part. I would say that the thing that took me the longest to really adjust, besides the format, like reformatting the way that this looked, was the card sort, which only took me about 15 to 20 minutes to put together. Everything else is super low prep, and it puts the work back onto the students where it should be. So remember to subscribe if you haven't already. And again, I'll put this product in the notes just in case you're interested in purchasing it.